So what we call that, this is the towards a regional strategy. We hope that we will have although we call it a dairy strategy, it's really a guiding document for the stakeholders in the region um, as to how they want to develop the dairy sector, mostly for the governments, but also for the private sector and other stakeholders. Uh, we This is the outline for this presentation. We will just do a quick recap of trends, and I think trends we are all very familiar with, so that should be, we'll just do a very fast recap of it. In your folder, we had put a document, and this was called the Strategy and Investment Plan for Smallholder Dairy Development in Asia. This document was developed in 2008, and there was a similar process that FAO had facilitated. About 55 to 60 stakeholders from across the region came together. There was a series of studies that were carried out before this document was developed. So, and then when the group met in February 2008, they had this, what they call the Chiang Mai Declaration. So we want to be able to build on the process that carried on at that time and the Chiang Mai Declaration. Of course, from the Chiang Mai Declaration onwards, some things may have changed, and we want to have a look at what might have changed, and do we need to have new vision and new strategic objectives that should go into the strategy. And then the final thing is how do we move forward. So that's the broad outline of what I thought we could follow. Well, starting point, growing share of Asia in milk production. No surprises here. We have heard it several times the last 2 days. Everybody knows about this. There's also a changing landscape within Asia. The traditional South Asia, milk producer South Asia continues to have the largest share, about 2/3, but there is now emergence of newer countries, newer non-traditional milk producing countries, in particular Vietnam, China, Thailand, growing very rapidly. So there is a bit of a shift in the landscape if you look at countries within Asia. Per capita milk consumption, as we heard, is still very low, although it is growing. In South Asia it is growing. Also East Asia is growing very rapidly. Not so rapidly in Southeast Asia, if you look at the trends at the country level. But nevertheless, there is a growing trend in per capita milk consumption. But if you were to, if the consumption levels in other regions are any indication of the potential, they may not be. But if that's any indication of the potential, then the headroom is really huge for growth. Whether we want to get there or not, that's a different question, one can debate. But this is just to illustrate the differences in per capita consumption across region. Net imports are growing. We have put out some numbers there. And the real, although the trade in dairy products is not as huge, if you look at the overall consumption at the global level, I think less than 10% of the dairy products are actually traded. 90% of it is domestically produced. But Southeast Asia in particular and East Asia, these are the key players in terms of trade and in particular the imports. New Zealand and Australia being the exporters, China and Southeast Asian countries being the importers. I think they account for a large share of trade. And I'm talking only about the milk and milk products. When we look at the feed, then of course it's a different story. I think this has been highlighted in a number of times that the production structures across the region are very diverse. And I just tried to get some numbers on the average farm sizes from this International Farms Comparison Network. And you can see that we are talking about India, Bangladesh being 2 to 3 animals. Southeast Asia a little bit larger, But even in countries like China, even there, the average farm size is around 5 to 6 um, animals. New Zealand, Australia, of course, have larger farm sizes. And Thailand has been scaling up gradually. If you look at over time, I mean, the Thailand going back 20 years ago was in a similar, small farm size is about 4, 5, or 6, but there has been scaling up happening. I don't know how rapid this is, but if you look at in the last 3, 4, 5 years, now we see emergence of large farms in Thailand, emergence of mega farms in Vietnam, also China, and so on. So the future, if you look at, if sort of, there may be a more rapid scaling up that could happen in some of the countries. Now, here are some numbers just to illustrate, just to sort of look at the milk prices. And the milk to feed price ratio, which could be some indication of the potential of or the competitiveness of different countries. And as you can see, the milk to feed price ratio, for example, Philippines, I mean, it doesn't really seem like that there is that it's favorably placed in terms of milk production because the feed prices are very high, and the milk price just does not compensate for the cost of the feed. Okay, so we come back, and I think I'm going to go to this document now. What we have been discussing over the last 2 days, that the sector does offer several opportunities. There are opportunities to improve productivity, whether we have an entry point from the production point of view or profitability. Even if we talk about profitability, I think the productivity remains an underlying feature of that profitability equation. Huge opportunities for quality gains, substituting imports, improving competitiveness. There's an environment issue. We have heard a lot about nutrition, income, jobs, livelihoods. We can go on and add a lot of other elements to these opportunities. So this was the backdrop for the Chiang Mai Declaration, and the Chiang Mai Declaration was an Asian glass of milk a day for every Asian child. That was sort of quite a catchy, title or catchy slogan, but inherent in this, of course, was the notion of nutrition. Inherent in this was a notion of regional self-reliance, if not self-sufficiency. An Asian glass of milk a day for every Asian child. This was the slogan. The vision statement from there, this is what the stakeholders who gathered in Chiang Mai in 2008, they were the ones who formulated this vision and mission statement. It is there in this document. I'm just putting it out for us, all of us, to see together. The vision statement was Asian milk for health and prosperity. Again, I think underlying this, of course, was the notion of nutrition and the fact that there's a large number of undernourished children in Asia region. And prosperity, and this was particularly focused on smallholders. Improving the competitiveness of smallholder milk producers to provide more and better quality milk and dairy products to Asian consumers. That was the mission statement that followed the vision. These were the strategic objectives that they formulated. Regional self-reliance and enhanced dairy food security. Since this particular strategy was actually focused more on smallholders, exclusively on smallholders, there was a strategic objective on better linking smallholders to markets, and then enabling them to become more commercial dairy entrepreneurs. So moving a bit more from a subsistence sort of production system to more market orientation, and graduating them from subsistence to entrepreneurs. There was an emphasis on dairy food chain, which means that each link in dairy food chain should become efficient, productive, profitable in a socially and environmentally responsible manner. So the notion of sustainability was very much built into these strategic objectives. There was also a strategic objective that dealt specifically with safety and quality, and then regional and national recognition of the multiple benefits of smallholder dairy production, because again, as I said, this was a smallholder dairy development strategy. They then went on and and deliberated as to how, what are the areas that we need to focus on in order to achieve these strategic objectives. And they identified 4 key strategic pillars. One that dealt with human resource and knowledge management. And again, I think this we have heard over the last 2 days, the technical capacity issues, facilitation of knowledge and facilitation of experiences across across countries and across stakeholders. So this was seen as an important strategic pillar to achieve the vision and the mission, the strategic objectives. The second strategic pillar focused more on productivity and competitiveness, and embedded in that would of course be the issues of feed, the issues of health, the issues of genetics, issues of reducing cost by promoting good practices and things like that. Then there was a third strategic pillar which focused on establishing market linkages, again emphasizing producer organizations, emphasizing establishing linkages between smallholders and the private sector, and facilitating those sort of linkages through various different mechanisms. And what encompassed the whole thing was enabling environment, which focused more on policy issues, issues in trade, issues in macroeconomics and regulatory policies. And in fact, they went on and identified further elements of this enabling environment, which are also outlined in one of the annexes in this document. And this document is available in your folders. So this was the strategic pillars that the stakeholders at that time identified. Now, what we are trying to sort of pick up a little bit on what we hear over the last 2 days, and whether there are any changes between what was discussed in 2008 and what we are discussing now. And these are some of the elements that we picked up. We may have missed a few, but just to sort of go through these, what we heard is that there is very strong positive outlook for the global dairy industry, and that outlook is very strong. But we also expect that there is we see increasing volatility when it comes to international prices, and I think the climate issues, the production risks, they are starting to manifest themselves into the prices. So even if one was to look at the price structure, the evolution of the price structure, we see much more volatile international price structure over the last 5 to 7 years than we saw before that. A point was made that there's rapidly declining common resource base, and of course we have repeatedly heard again and again the pressure on feed resources, and this resulting into growing feed costs and hurting the competitiveness of dairy production in the region. There is increasing environmental concerns. Those issues which may not have been very important 10 years ago are now becoming part of popular narrative. And although enforcement is still very varying across countries, but at the global level at least now there's far more enforcement of these environmental issues, and that affects also the regional and the global dairy landscape. Increased consumer demand for food safety, convenience, and quality. Then I think this growing intensity and pressure to intensify and scale up, and part of it is because of the resource scarcity, and part of it is also because, as was pointed out yesterday, there are newer opportunities outside the dairy sector that affects the labor product, the labor equation and the wages. People move out, so the technology has to step in. If the technology steps in, scale goes up. So there is really an adjustment on trying to get more output per unit of land, per unit of water, and per unit of labor. But having said all of that, if we were to take a sort of broad brush of the region, we still, it's pretty smallholder dominated. 80% of the local milk marketed in Asia is still coming from smallholder production systems. So they remain the most important component of uh, the dairy development equation, so to say. And I think what we heard again and again over the last 2 days was that the expectations that the dairy would actually contribute to social goals such as poverty, livelihood support, nutrition. Those expectations are still very strong. And people still expect dairy to deliver on some of those social objectives. So this is what we thought that there are new realities that the sector needs to adapt to, which means this adaptation has to come in the form of enhanced efficiency of use of natural resources, including land and labor, protection of soil, water, and biodiversity. There is a much larger role of private sector now than may have been 2 decades ago. And that's a new reality that the sector has to take on board. That's perhaps a positive sign. There's also an increasing internalization of the dairy value chain now. And there's trade is growing. Ingredients are being imported. There's production happening in different countries and so on and so forth. So there is much more internationalized value chain. Climate change agenda is becoming stronger. Protection against diseases, and then I think we are hearing this more and more now that because of these increasing risks, that we need to have specific focus on how do you make more resilient production systems. This is what we heard. Not everybody may have heard the same thing. So I'm just okay. So what are the possible elements of response to this? Again, this is what we heard, which is that we need to have continued focus on production and productivity. Although whether we define productivity in terms of profitability or whether we define in terms of productivity and production, that can be debated. But even if one talks about profitability, production and productivity remains and one of the elements of the profitability equation. But sustainably intensifying and increasing productivity more sustainably to meet the increasing demand. That's one of the responses that we need to have. Focus on dairy value chain by bringing in measures to improve food quality and safety while at the same time reducing post-harvest losses. Considering the importance of small producers, focus and perhaps strengthened focus on institutional structures that can integrate small producers into the modern value chain. We have examples in the region. Co-ops, of course, are one of the institutional structures, but there are perhaps other models. There is the dairy hub model. There are different kinds of models but we need to perhaps look at these institutional structures and see how to promote and which sort of institutional structures to promote in what sort of socio-political environments, just so that the small producers continue to have a strategic role into the emerging modern value chain. But we also heard, I think, the experience of school milk programs from Thailand, from Vietnam, from Bangladesh, and a lot of these linked to local dairy operations. Thailand in particular is an example. Thailand now has about a $500 million annual budget just to support the school milk program. And they have had specific policy elements to link it to local dairy operations and then in that manner promote the local dairy sector. Is that an element of response? I do not know. We would leave it to the groups to debate. Uh, there has also been a lot of talk about enhancing consumer education to enable them making more informed choices when it comes to milk and dairy products. Strengthening capacity to cope with production and market risks, minimizing environmental footprint and improving the mitigation and adaptation to climate change, and enhancing the enabling environment. Again, the elements of enabling environment would relate to macroeconomic policy, they will relate to trade issues, and so on and so forth, but that we heard that that's going to remain as an integral part of whatever response strategy we come up with. So this again is sort of is more general, but trying to pick up on for last 2 days discussion. Where do we go from here? And I think that's going to that's the question.